Hello, everyone. I'm Brad. I'm the Director of Technology at Senson. I've been at Senson since the start. I'm one of the founding teams. I've been at Senson for 7 and a bit years. Background SecOps, so everything I'm talking about, a lot of it's kind of based from my experience. I used to run security operations for EE. I used to run the hunt team across like BT doing kind of advanced persistent threat analysis. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of the SIEMs and how like Senson is trying to approach this from a very, very different way from what you've seen. If you want to ask questions at any point, I'll try and keep an eye on those questions and I can kind of catch up with those as they come in. Let me just make sure I've got the right window up. Um, Today we're going to talk about why SIEMs are failing security teams. We're going to be talking about some of the biggest challenges and particularly the costs around data growth, some of the issues around how you prioritize what's important, some people skills, how they're changing, and kind of actually what it means for you in terms of potentially salaries. Senson's approach to this might get a chance to go through a quick demo of the Senson platform, but I will intend to get through this in about 25-30 minutes, so I don't want to kind of drag this on longer than necessarily needs to. So definitely won't be using the full hour. So fundamentally, I think we've got a bit of a problem in our industry where an attacker who gets into your environment, from the data that we see and the data that's published by other sources like CrowdStrike, says that an attacker will move towards your domain controller in an hour. And I am not convinced that the majority of people have set up their kind of operations to be able to do that with a SIEM. And that's even before we get into there, like in terms of the speed, in terms of the quality of the response. It's just there is a huge engineering and speed challenge, and I do not think SIEM's the best place right now for most organizations to be able to meet that 1 hour target, and that 1 hour target is kind of set by your adversary because the adversary's got to say in all of this. And broadly, some key themes we'll be going through is some of the additional challenges and cost, how this kind of manifests itself in noise and how that's kind of challenging to deal with, and how we've tried and failed to automate in a few different processes that are going on there. But before we do, data growth. Now we're generating more and more data within our organizations, and we're generating more and more data globally. So the chart just shows kind of the exponential growth of data, but within security teams, you have access to more data. When I kind of joined the industry, we all had servers, and without, people there would talk about migration from the mainframes at the time. Then we moved to kind of virtual servers. Then we moved from traditional virtual servers onto things like Kubernetes and containers and kind of microservices. And now we're kind of often moving towards serverless infrastructure. The challenge is we're generating more and more data over time, and it's not just that data is large now, but it's just growing, and that is a growing challenge for security teams, particularly when you're setting your budgets over the next kind of 3, 5, or longer years. So Albert Einstein said, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. And you are going to be paying a tax, effectively this kind of compound tax on your security operations if you continue doing what you're doing in terms of continuing to kind of push more things in the SIEM, and there's additional challenges for that. And not only are we generating more logs, but the actual size of the logs are increasing. So syslog was the de facto kind of method of doing logging. And syslog would work because it would encapsulate the log in a UDP packet. It would fire it over a network. And because it was constrained into a single UDP packet at the time, it constrained it to kind of a sensible MTU with additional headers. So it put an MTU limit of 1024 bytes on a kind of syslog entry. Today, Windows event logs are much bigger. They encapsulate them with XML, and kind of that means that the Windows event log size is 32 kilobytes. Now, it doesn't stop there in terms of kind of growth for your SIEM and the challenges in the SIEM, because that raw log file needs to go through a process of kind of normalization, and it will often go through a kind of process of correlation and enrichment. So your log file, hypothetically, let's just call it 32 gigs. We'll take the extreme example here. You're going to kind of get that raw log file. You then need to pull out key parameters. So you want to be like, if you've got a time, you want to kind of make sure you're consistently logging the time across everything. So you probably want to put down a consistent time zone. Maybe you want to kind of also log the time you ingested it. You also, if you've got any IP addresses and a kind of a long string, which is your raw log file, you probably want to map them to individual fields into your SIEM. So you'll probably write a horrific regular expression, be like, this is the source IP address, this is the destined IP address, and ultimately that means that data is kind of getting reproduced and getting more in your database. You're then going to kind of enrich it. You want to be like, right, I've got this IP address. Where in the world is it? That could be in this country, and then I might want to apply a risk profile to that country. I might want to put the city and the geolocation on there. There's so much you can do, especially when you kind of start adding and putting in other intelligence sources in there. This means that raw log file is kind of going to get kind of grow, and it's going to often double or triple in size, especially when it kind of maps to one of your SIEM schemas. So that 32 kilobyte raw log file may, in an extreme example, actually be 100 kilobytes for a single log file, which is absolutely boggling to me from someone who kind of entered the industry, and grep was the thing that I used to kind of search through log files in terms of that raw logs files. And this is a problem because SIEM vendors know this, and they've switched to a model that is consumption-based pricing. And they know you're going to be spending more data, and your log files are going to be getting kind of bigger, and they're going to be getting more and more data. So they're like, well, actually, we'll give you the flexibility to manage that. And the way they do that is they kind of start you off, and it's like a free drugs pricing model. They start you off for free. You're like, oh, life's great. I've got this free tool. And then kind of suddenly you're hooked into it, and you've got to start spending an absolute fortune in terms of this. So Azure Sentinel does this quite well. They give you free data sources, Azure audit logs, Office 365 audit logs, alerts from Defender. And they're like, if you're an E5 subscriber, because most people are, because not necessarily, it may not be the security decision, it might be because your CIO loves Excel and wants the full fat version, and then you can bundle some security tools in there. Why wouldn't you? I'd do that. But that gives you an extra 5 megs per day per E5 user. But then they start you off on this free track, and it's like a drug dealer where your first hit's free. Over time, you're sort of locked into that. So I'm going to explore this on a fictitious example organization. What I've got here is I've got a 1,000-person organization. I've just kind of said, you know what, we're going to log everything. We're going to take 150 servers, which is pretty standard for most companies. And I've taken the log calculator from a competitor. So this one, not a competitor, kind of a traditional SIEM platform for you to kind of estimate your own costs. So what I've done, 1,000 end user devices, turned on EDR logging, 100 Windows servers, gone 50 medium events per second. I've gone 50 Linux servers, 6 firewalls, and 3 IPSs. Based upon this, it gave me a kind of calculation of the kind of log entries. And it said I should be generating and expecting 189 gigs per day. 189 gigs a day is 5.7 terabytes of logs per month, which is 89 terabytes of logs per year, which, my golly, that's just a ridiculous amount of data that you need to get and manage within your environment. Now, you can kind of go to providers, and you can I've taken the off-the-shelf listing as of last month on the website from the Azure pricing. And if you can navigate it, you can kind of get towards, I want to kind of take my 189 gigs, and this is a worst case. I'm using an extreme example. Your reality will probably be half the amount of that. But let's say I wanted to go for the normal Sentinel logs, which is called analytic logs in Sentinel speak. It would give me a price of £559.62 per day. I don't know any SIEM provider which judges their cost per day when you're looking at these kind of pricing. It shows the kind of craziness of how expensive that's going to be. That comes up at that 204 grand a year if you're going for that discount level with Azure. Now, there are 2 ways you can bring this cost down. Well, there's more than that, but I'll go through a couple of them. One way, you log less. Most people aren't going to be logging probably 189 gigs per day for a 1,000-person organization. Generally, my experience is probably half that is kind of a reasonable estimate.
Also, you might be an absolute baller and like love, be in with Microsoft. That's cool. Often, kind of when you're going all in on these providers, they can give you additional discounts on top of this. And then finally, I'm talking about analytic logs, and those are the logs which allow you to run alerts on and write analytics for and do kind of get the full features of Azure Sentinel. You can also use basic logs. Basic logs are about half the price. You can't write analytics, and you get paid. You have to pay money every time you run a search for them. But that's just a bit, yeah, that's painful for an analyst thinking you've got to pay money every time you run a search across your environment. And going back to kind of the previous points of like, you have to be on this in an hour, getting through to root cause. That is the time limit that is set by your adversary. Let's just ignore for the moment and park the whole concept of you have to be in your environment and you have to be one of the fastest team to respond. Your adversary will be on your DC in an hour. And that's the time limit that I strongly recommend you kind of hold in your thought when you're kind of thinking of what will be the appropriate approach. Now, we used to kind of try and prioritize logs. There's a couple of different ways of thinking about this. I'm on a couple of Signal groups and kind of WhatsApp groups. Most of you are. Someone was saying how their approach is to log everything, and that's great when you've got absolutely tons of money. Most people don't do that. So it's part of old school. The industry's moved on a little bit, but we used to kind of do, and this is not necessarily because of the industry, but we used to do MITRE ATT&CK heat mapping of the adversaries of what we want to do. God bless MITRE. I don't know if they're still working from them because they're a US federally funded organization. And we kind of used to kind of map and monitor the key techniques that we were worried about by our own adversaries and used to prioritize them. But then often there's a requirement of, oh, there's something else. And, I know if you're in the retail sector right now, you're probably getting smashed with all sorts of things, all sorts of requirements, all sorts of different attack paths you've never seen before. And this is often the case when there's a near miss in the industry or something happens to a competitor on there. So there is actually a drive, and over time you just end up logging more and more. And it's a huge challenge to, once you start logging something, to actually turn it off. Very, very few people turn things off. It's more kind of log more and more over time. And that's ignoring the whole friction that you've probably experienced. If you're a security team and you've got a separate IT team, if you're the security team and you want to go for a log, you're like, I want this log. And then that's fine. The IT team will do that. But they're like, oh, I don't want that more, but I want this one. And it's this constant thing and ask, and it all leads to friction between IT and security teams and organizations. So we used to kind of do this assessment, this risk-based assessment, and it used to be like, how many events per day it is, what's the coverage, is it a lot of value? But then fundamentally, people constantly keep going, yeah, but can you log my firewall? And I know I would die on this hill. Firewalls generate the most egregious amounts of logs, more than anything else on the environment. And the vast majority of the time, when you're looking at just accepts and drops, kind of as a data source, it's actually incredibly, like, it's not heavily used. It is one of the least valuable data sources and cost benefit analysis, but people still go, can you log my firewall? And that's fine. That's their approach. And that's because often this is driven by auditors, and this is driven by non-practitioners who are kind of asking for this kind of key information. So talked about this growing and getting bigger. So let's take a kind of, our logged enterprise volume was going to be kind of, over the course of a year, we're kind of looking at around about 100 terabytes a year. So let's say we worked it down, and wrong. Let's say we're kind of logging around about kind of 35 gigs. 35 terabytes, why can't I speak properly? And that we got our cost down to a reasonable amount, which is 132,000. We talked earlier about how we're getting more logs. We're also talking about how the logs are getting bigger. So on average, we see a compound growth rate of logs for most enterprises of about 28 to 42%. I'm going to take the extreme example of that, but based upon you logging this and kind of it growing up over time, over 10 years, that 132,000 US dollars a year that you're spending on kind of just the log collection will grow, if you're taking the extreme example, will grow to over 3 million US dollars a year, which is absolutely bonkers. 30% is the average growth rate we see in SIEM logs over time. So slightly less than that, but kind of just bear that in mind if you're often when people are signing contracts or looking at these kind of tools, they're signing in contracts most normally for kind of 3 years. Think of your 3-year data growth over time. This is just very, very painful. And I'm really hammering home kind of SIEMs and the costs of them, and the challenges of that. Because, when I joined the industry, I bought a collector. I could see and touch it in the rack. I would be like, that is my log collector. And I bought the biggest, fattest one that I could buy from the vendor at the time. I think it was a McAfee at the time. Then it became Intel Security. Then it became McAfee again. And then God knows what kind of companies it end up with and what products end up with now. But I bought them physically in the rack. And everyone at the time was talking about EPS, or events per second. No one's really talking about EPS anymore. Everyone's talking about that kind of data size cost thing. But also, there's additional things you need to buy in a SIEM. Let's face it, a SIEM is great at processing information, pulling out the key bits, writing analytics on top of that, but you need to buy other things. You need to feed it with data. So often you might need to go buy like an NDR, you might need to go buy a SAW for the automation. We'll come on to that in a minute. SAW's horrifically expensive. You've also got to spend a huge amount of time kind of getting that log source and then doing the normalization and the enrichment and then writing analytics on top of that. If you don't get that right, that has a massive operational burden. And that is either the operational burden is they're dealing with so much like junk, or on the other side is they're completely, well, you're not seeing the things that you should do in a timely enough manner. And just going back to that 1 hour timeline that is kind of brought about by our adversaries, that's the time that we need to be responding is. And if you've got this level of noise, you're going to really kind of struggle to get to the most important things as quickly as possible. I'll go on to people because people are changing quite a bit. So if you look at cybersecurity jobs over time, 6% of all IT jobs are now in security, which is great. Clearly a growing industry. And the cybersecurity workforce globally has grown in the last year. Figures by the ICSC squared. A group said it's kind of grown by almost a tenth. It's grown by 8.3%. The UK cybersecurity workforce is estimated to be around about 370,000 people, but they still estimate there's a shortage of 73,500. I'm not sure how, I'm not confident of those figures, and I'll come on to why. So we obviously work in a supply and demand economy, capitalist societies, and we can track, and there are stats, and this is the stats from IT JobsWatch that I pulled off in March, and it's looking at cybersecurity average salaries over time. You can see this big spike down here, this big spike kind of, 2010. That is the kind of class consultant bandwagon, I think, when there's a small number of people absolutely on that government security gravy train. Well done to them. Great time to be in the industry with such a small number of people and kind of having to respond to government requirements for that. But the government, the NCC, kind of brought the industry back into line and goes, this is getting a bit silly in terms of this. And over time, generally, we have seen cybersecurity's salary growth not to be that great, particularly in the last couple of years when we've seen tech layoffs, we're seeing more and more use of AI and tools, we've seen more people in the industry. But on the whole, you're kind of seeing that it's kind of salaries over time aren't growing at a massive rate. Kind of the medium salary from around about kind of 2023 was £65,000 of jobs that were advertised then. It's dropped to about 55,000 in 2025. There are still, if you look at the 10th percentile, there are still around about 10% of those IT jobs paying more than 100 grand a year. But this is, on the whole, the supply is absolutely, salaries are not kind of going up on every role across the industry year on year. And I think that's something we've seen, particularly as we look to hire analysts and we look to hire other people. And a lot of this are kind of changes within the tech industry. Couple of points on that. When we hire remote SOC analysts all the time. It is the most incredibly competitive position in the company, being a kind of junior SOC analyst. We see tremendous numbers of people trying to join the industry. On the junior level, we can often get hundreds of applications, if not thousands of applications, depending on where we're hiring for a remote. On the senior level, on the other hand, very few people are competent. We get a fair few applications at the senior level, but they're not competent. And I think that's because many people who are coming in at junior levels
are being like a toolset expert. I am this product, I am this EDR's kind of go-to person. I know how to set it up, where all the buttons are, know how that was, but they don't understand. On the whole, there are some really good analysts out there, but less and less analysts kind of have that kind of technical foundation of things like, how does TCP work? How do things get loaded in Linux? How do DLLs actually work in kind of Windows? All of this kind of stuff. Also, you go back 10 years, people would have to build things. They would often have to kind of, build tooling from scratch, like build the database, write things in Perl or Python to kind of find what you want. Often it's like buy things off. And there's often disconnected tool sets. You'll buy like an email security tool and then do your email there. You might buy you buy lots of individual tools, but they're not really that connected, and it's very hard to do an end-to-end investigation. And then just finally, kind of some of the kind of masquerading automation piece, but we generally find that well, people have been talking about, the SIEMs were meant to be that single pane of glass, and that single pane of glass was meant to be like, oh, it's going to be all my security logs, it's going to automate everything on there, but it never really kind of came to be, because people are actually, I need to buy another automation tool for that single pane of glass, and you'd have to go buy a SOAR or a security orchestration and response platform. Absolutely in love with SOARs. I think they're awesome when done right. They're very rarely done right. They're tremendously expensive, and you have to buy them on top of your existing SAMs. And also, they can hook you in with that consumption-based billing model, which, when you look at what's been gone on historically in terms of SIEMs and the challenges there, I'm reluctant, and I would be nervous about something that has a kind of consumption-based pricing. And then also, just kind of back a point I've missed on kind of the SIEMs, because you've got lots of disconnected log sources that aren't tied together. When you've got lots of things that are kind of together, it's really hard to pivot between different data sources and get through to root cause on there. And then finally, kind of that mean time to resolve, like, and I've said it quite a few times, but the threat actor will decide the response level that's needed. If it's not within an hour, they're likely to be on your DC. That's what we see upon average in terms of the time you've got really to contain it. I routinely speak to people who are using managed service providers or their average response times, and they're looking at response times that are, often I'll see 6 to 8 hour SLAs. Sometimes I'll hear about next business day SLAs, which is absolutely to bonkers. Like, how have we as an industry, come to a position where we're defining these contractual SLAs and thinking about this, but it's just so disconnected from the kind of job that we need to do of responding into under an hour. So I'll come back to this in a moment. I'll just kind of take you through the platform and kind of our approach in terms of, we've got quite a different way of dealing with this and getting, basically, we believe we can get the same business outcomes as a SIEM without going through that kind of cost and complexity of a SIEM. I'll kind of talk through that. Which one should I go through? And this, first of all, is, so I'll explain how Senson gets our data, and then after I kind of explain how we get our data and what we do with it, I'll kind of talk about how we can do a lot of that automation, and that can kind of lead to kind of those same outcomes. And I'll just come back to kind of talk about some of the business value. I'll aim to go through the product in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to kind of skim the surface of it as quickly as possible. So firstly, Sense will come in, we can connect to a wide number of your individual data sources. So it could be stuff like, you love, hypothetically, let's say you love Defender. That's cool. We can pull that data in. Just a quick stat for you. If you're using the E5 stack, great. But what we find is that when you turn on everything, let's say you turn on Defender for Cloud, Defender for Endpoint, you turn on MCAS, we've seen customers where they are generating 0.8 alerts per user per month, and that's almost 1 alert per user per month, which is a bit bonkers. And the way that it's currently managed when you're using the Microsoft native tooling is you just ignore anything that isn't a high priority alert, but there's still value in those information on those low alerts. And those kind of medium scoring alerts that are just kind of ignored at the moment in those platforms. So we'll pull that in and we'll use that in a moment. I'll show you how we kind of correlate that to other things. We'll also pull in data from other sources. And this means these native integrations mean we kind of know the data structure and we know that what's coming in. Also, we'll look to deploy what we call universal sensor. And this universal sensor can optionally displace your EDR. It's not going to displace your EDR for every single case. Like some of you will love your EDR, and that's fine. We can hook and integrate into CrowdStrike or kind of Sentinel-1, or we could do that with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, but we can absolutely displace that if we need to. Still, we would look to deploy a universal sensor across every single one of those devices, and that universal sensor will do some awesome things. The first things it's going to do is it will do full deep packet inspection on every single endpoint. This means we are going to analyze traffic on every physical and virtual interface coming in and out of the interface and log that centrally in a consistent manner. That means, just take the example of DNS. That means I do not care that you're logging in info blocks, or you're logging in Active Directory and using the DNS there, or that you're logging your DNS hypothetically kind of using a cloud service. We can see that from, or we can see, or you're using bind, I can see that from the perspective of the packets, and I can reassemble that in a consistent format that is the same across Mac, Windows, Linux. It could be the same as we don't necessarily need to worry as much about proxy logs, because I can see the web traffic from every single endpoint bidirectionally on there. We also, and I believe today we're the only provider who does this, we can correlate every single one of those network flows back to the process that launched it and the user that did there. So we could be like, show me every network connection that was made by Bob Smith going externally, not on the machine, on the actual permissions of the process. Or when you have a weird process, where did that process go? What was it doing over the network? And that means it's quicker and easier to get back to root cause, and we're more tightly doing this than the way that you would massively struggle to do this in the SIEM. We also, from those endpoints, we're able to kind of collect and generate consistent logging information, the kind of things you'd probably be doing on most systems for the logs: who's logged in there, what applications are running, kernel modules that are loaded, all that kind of, ARP tables, all that kind of common stuff will come into the platform. And we'll also get all of that kind of EDR style logging. And optionally, we can do the full endpoint protection and antivirus, but that's optional. We can turn that on. So what? That means we're collecting data that's in a consistent manner, and we're collecting a ridiculous amount of data. So this is a real world box. On this real world box, I've got 154 systems reporting back in from the last 28 days. And on this box, I've pulled in and generated 14.1 billion events. Every single one of those is directly accessible to you in the platform. That's broken down across 1.2 billion things on the endpoint, nearly 13 billion things on the network, and 1 million things from the cloud. To put that in perspective, that is around about 100 million raw events per end device that's coming into the platform. Now, that is just stuff you either don't need to do in your SIEM or don't need to do your SIEM at all, and that is consistent, normalized, correlated data that we will give you in a licensing model that's done on a per endpoint basis without doing any kind of consumption-based pricing model. That also means that out the box, we can run 1,100 analytics, and we can produce a massive number of individual kind of security observations on that. On this box, we've generated 6,600 things that we think are unusual. And those are things that could be like super low confidence. It could be something like someone logging in at a weird time. It could be an example I'll show you in a minute. It could be something like, a weird process we've seen. So like, here's an example of something you would not care about, but is actually interesting in the wider context. So we will create an observation here saying the Windows registry was launched by PowerShell and it was done by this user. Who cares? By itself, you'd look at that as an analyst and goes, there isn't enough information. That's just kind of background noise. But for every observation, we look to correlate it and find mappings to other things that we think are interesting. And here we found an observation before. We can see in this case, a connection was made from the same process, PowerShell, the same parent process, and then that process was run by the same user, in this case, a local EMIR, and it was going externally, and it was going out to payspin. And suddenly that kind of subtle indicator becomes really interesting in a sequence of lots of individual things, and that enables us to build a high priority case which consists of data of kind of network, endpoint, in some cases third-party data that we're pulling in from integrations like Identity, Defender for Endpoint, and kind of other cloud logs that we'll pull into the platform. And that means we can kind of very, very quickly, out the box, we can deploy our endpoint software, collect logs in a unified manner, have analytics that genuinely work, do prioritization across a wide number of sources, and then show you, like immediately show you high priority cases, and enable you to deliver your security operations really, really effectively. And the so what of that is when it comes to running these investigations, you can respond faster than kind of, incredibly fast. Some of the people on this call will be kind of partners, kind of looking at this and kind of their models. But we can optionally deliver the 24/7 SOC ourselves. Partners could potentially run this, or you can run this in hybrid models within your own company. But these stats on this box are representative of our real environment. On this box here, we've had an average time to acknowledge of about 3 minutes. Our average time to acknowledge globally is about 6 to 8 minutes. And then we've got an average time to investigate on this box of 17 minutes, which is slightly slower than the average, actually, which is about 12 to 14 minutes. But our average time to resolve is bang on kind of 18 to 20 minutes for most customers most of the time. 30 minutes is our kind of max internal SLA before we're kind of taking actions quite significantly to reduce that. And going back to that, you need to respond in an hour. Like, this is genuinely a different approach for that. And this means we can kind of cover a huge amount of traction within your environment and have a genuine alternative to deploying SIEMs, which is bringing together all of these different data sources, all of these different perspectives, and automating the hell out of it to enable you to deliver better, more interesting security observation and get through to root cause. I won't go into it today, but there's all sorts of kind of visualizations that you can do within the platform. Haven't opened them up here. All sorts of visualizations. You can access the raw data. It's all through SQL. And you've got a really pretty visualizations and alerts and other stuff that you can do. We can also do the full remediation in the platform as well. So that remediation could be killing processes, terminating things that we see maliciously in real time if we're running the endpoint protection. We can also look to what was I trying to say there? We've also got kind of a remote forensic feature which allows us to drop onto any endpoint, and you can do full remote forensics on those devices, and you can do things like disable accounts in Microsoft 365. You could isolate systems from the network. So there's all this automatic remediation and manual remediation that can be done on that. I won't go into the product too much further today, but our normal approach when we speak to kind of an end user or organization is kind of we figure out where they're spending their money and we'll come in. This is some analysis from a real world customer of ours, and kind of how we were kind of able to reduce their costs by well over half. So they're spending 1.2 million on tooling. They had a managed SOC they were also paying on top of the tooling of 450,000. So the overall tooling cost and managed SOC cost, 1.6 million quid a year, which is absolutely bonkers. And then internally, they had a 4-person SOC. And these guys had the traditional SIEM. And then because of the budgets, they would generate 225 tickets per month. There was a limit on that. They would hit this limit, and then the team would quite literally stop working on new tickets. And then they also had challenges because I understand, but the managed partner in this case was trying to go through this normalization correlation and had even more friction because they wanted new log sources, but they're not internal. They have to ask the security team, then it has to go to the IT team. And that just means that for this customer, they only generated 36 new detections, which were accepted by the customer in 18 months. And that's absolutely bonkers. And this means actually the managed SOC were kind of processing these tickets. They would pass 40 tickets a month, which if my team did that for one customer, I would be livid. That's way too high. And then the internal SOC would assess that as kind of at a 95% false positive rate, which meant that they had kind of an 8-hour mean time to resolve, which actually isn't that bad, but they're certainly missing a lot of things. Came in terms of the new tooling and managed SOC costs. There's additional costs there that aren't factored in for other tooling that they still needed to consider. They were spending around about £800,000 on tooling. Managed SOC, which is mostly for Sense on cost, was 150,000, and they still maintain their internal SOC. We kind of used our approach here to kind of get that data, get 1,100 analytics out the box. And then the SOC has now got the capacity to like investigate and manage all of those alerts, and we were able to reduce and keep that mean time to resolve under 30 minutes, around about 20 minutes in this case. So massively reduced costs across the overall security team and kind of have better customer outcomes of that. Wide number of customers, we're fairly significant in the UK. We've got some of our customers on the screen there, but we believe the future of Sense-On and the future of the industry is something that we refer to as the intelligence cloud. And that is this collection of data which is generated from our universal sensor and customized stuff which is coming in from various APIs. And then we can deliver the managed service. On top of that, partners can deliver that as well. So I'm pleased, like if you're a partner, let's have a conversation after in terms of kind of how you can kind of fit into terms of this ecosystem. And this means that kind of we can deliver and you can deliver kind of really effective, fast security operations genuinely at lower cost. And you can deliver like it is very, very effective in this space on there. Um, I won't go through in terms of the background, but really unifying that. Just a quick note in terms of the universal sensor. So people are often worried about the resources of deploying another kind of endpoint sensor, which is capturing additional telemetry. Just a note on that, the vast majority of that is kind of all done in house. All of the kind of deep packet inspection is all our own code. It's all done in like very high performance C++. And the way we kind of architect, I can talk more about it away from kind of an open call, is done that if we're not running the endpoint protection, so we're not running the antivirus effectively, we will consume around about 0.5%, so 0.5% of a CPU. And on our website, we kind of talk about how the resource utilization and memory usage is around about 90 megs. It's actually, we've reduced that down to about 18 megs on average. If you are running the endpoint protection, that will go higher. So it's an extra, probably on average, it's about an extra 0.25% of a CPU on top of that. And if you're running kind of that antivirus component or the UPP component, we'll use another 200 megs of RAM. So if you're just doing the log collection, we turn those features off. Again, we can work with your EPP kind of or EDR, whichever you're using, or we can kind of displace it. So we're not kind of restricted to that. So overall, we can deploy in, you're getting the value and the benefits of AV, NDR, EDR, kind of cover and integrate with kind of various cloud environments, which we can go into kind of another time. And then we try and automate the hell out of everything in there. So, and this will be delivered through kind of our managed SOC services on top of that, but I won't go through that. So I won't go through in terms of the other business benefits because, you know, technical, I like focusing on the technical stuff, but generally, like we will deliver like very effective and sufficient security operations, which will achieve what you wanted with kind of a SIEM and what you probably wanted with a SOAR and what you envisioned and managed. And we can deliver this in software directly by deploying to your environment. So we can come in, we can do a proof of value, and you can kind of see these benefits immediately across the estate. We just ask you to deploy to 100 devices. And the reason why we ask you to deploy to 100 devices is anyone can come into an environment, deploy on 1 or 2 systems, run some tests, and lo and behold, the system's flagging up. Oh, it's found all these sorts of things. You really see the value and you really see the difference when you look at the quality of the real world cases that come through, and also kind of the quality of the SOC operations that sit behind that. And that means when we come in, we can show you organically what the system is finding, rather than it being like a contrived test scenario where we show different kinds of things. I'll come to a couple of questions in a minute, so feel free to kind of ask them in the chat and I'll go through them in a minute. But my email address is on there. Connect to me on LinkedIn as well if you want to. And we've got a kind of newsletter on the website. But I'll go through some of the questions now. Please feel free to kind of add others.